kicked out, or did something different happen?
No, the breakout session ended. That one was shorter. It was 15 minutes.
Can we have our same group back to the next one? Because I think we just got
we scratched the surface.
You will be in the same group for the next one for 30 minutes.
Aaron hired a student assistant that joined our meeting for a few seconds. And you're muted, I think.
Hey, God, I'm gonna miss that too. I've gotten in some little trouble this year because I've been on mute most of the time. So I think we'll share out to the whole group now. Obviously that was more of a review of what we talked about last time, but we want to hear if there were any additional thoughts. Why don't we start with the LEA group, since it was combined into one big group, and see if there was anything new you'd like to add to the discussion. You have a representative. Tom Ray was at our group, Scott.
Well, this is Tom. I'll take this one because I think I threw Ray under the bus the last time we reported on it. I mean, I think we just got to the fact that we agree that the learning permit is not the preferred moniker for this license. We would prefer something like apprentice teacher license. It gives it a little more respect, and so that was the recommendation. Then we started having a really good conversation about the requirements. I feel like it was the consensus of this group that having some kind of completed program that is associate's degree is preferable to considering just a collection of courses, and so having that understanding or that confidence that somebody's been through a coherent program that is situated somewhere below a bachelor's degree would be preferable than considering just hours of college taking towards that. It seems to me like if somebody has I have 50 hours of semester hours of credits, that it would be fairly easy for them to go back and get that AA if that's if they went into the classified TA position first and allow them to remediate and get to a position where they can enter the apprentice model. So I think one of the really good things about this is you've got that classified position that districts can put folks in as they remediate any missing requirements they would have to move into that apprentice model. And that's when the lights went out.
Okay. And right before the lights went out, I was going to chime in a little bit. So if I can just share briefly,
Sure.
I think we started talking about the requirements for what a teacher assistant is, and then I think we were discussing the idea that this apprentice teacher needs to be at a higher level than what a requirement for a TA is. But the other thing I wanted to mention though is that if the goal is getting an apprentice teacher into license 1, 2, or 3, and the minimum there is going to be a bachelor's, I think figuring out what completion of credit hours at a 4-year institution might look like to get there might be helpful, because I agree about a random collection of hours, but if somebody's completed 60 credit hours towards a bachelor's degree, then they might be in as good a place as somebody who completed an associate. So I wouldn't want to rule them out, but I don't know where you draw the line around minimum set of hours versus hours that could be leading to completion of a program. So that's the only thing I wanted to add right before the lights went out. So,
If I might jump in there, Jeff, because that ties really nicely into what we were just getting into when the lights turned down on us in group two, which is maybe breaking down some components of that 4-year program. So instead of a number of credit hours or number of hours, I think Andrew was trying to get us to think outside of, inputs and into outputs. But I guess where I was thinking is like, there are components, again, that are pieces of that are not just random credit hours, but say, successful completion of an internship experience, for example, or methods where there is an output to that. There's an evaluation at the end of that piece, right? So you have, and I'm thinking from the EPP perspective, and I'm sure there's room in here for other ways to get there, right? But from an EPP perspective in a 4-year institution, we could probably identify some components of that are not just course credits, that are more of what's the word I'm looking for, like a segment of that coherent program that we could break it down into, perhaps. So that tied in really nicely to kind of where we were when we got booted out of the room.
And Christina, this is Randy. I'm also wondering, I know something we've talked about in the past is very related to those components, is taking one step further back and talking about what I'll call the competencies that underlie those components. That if we really clearly articulate what are the competencies that these individuals, these candidates are gaining through their preparation, and then we have outputs to demonstrate that they've attained those competencies, but first defining what those competencies are, be them related to content or pedagogy, or the intersection, could be really helpful for us to then get a better understanding of, like, for example, where EPPs could help out and where current components of the EPP programs are tapping into.
Yeah, I think that's important, Randy. I think the other thing just popped into my head as I think about our early coursework and the kinds of outputs that we have in place. A really important one for EPPs is the dispositional assessments to ensure that they also have the right frame of mind and competencies there. I'm not sure in the teacher pathway, the associate's degree, if there's a place for that kind of assessment or not. It might be nice to partner with them to make sure that that's happening at that level as well. Lisa, if you're on here, if you know that or not.
Randy, your reference to competencies was at the point of entry. So the person is able to exhibit evidence that says, because of this, I'm able to be appointed as an apprentice.
Yeah, I think so. Or at, license 2, whatever it might be. And Hank, I think you raise a really interesting example. Like when we break it down to the level of the competencies that are expected in order to be at each level, then it allows us to think about, like, really what is it that this individual, what are the skills and demonstrated competencies that an individual should have. And I think it frees us up then to think about more holistically, and Hank, to your point, that that dispositions may come into play too. So that's a competency that we need to have. So now we need to have evidence of that, which is the output, right, in some form or fashion. So I just think it frees us up to think more operationally and deliberately about each of these successive steps.
I just, another thought, Superintendent Truitt was in a meeting that I was in earlier this week, and she mentioned that it's time to look at the teacher evaluation instrument, and that ties really closely to what Randy's talking about competencies, right? And it would, if that is in fact a step that's being taken concurrently with this work, it would be nice to, if that could all tie together, right? So that teacher evaluation and those competencies that are important for successful teaching, can be part of the process and part of the evaluation work that goes on towards assessing where somebody falls on this continuum. In developing some kind of rubric or instrument that could be used to measure these outcomes or competencies.
Hank, I think this is pretty consistent, and Aaron was taking notes in our group. This is pretty parallel to what we talked about. Different language in our group is sort of the same, unpacking the same problem.
Well, that's good stuff. And like we said earlier in the meeting, we'll definitely circle back to this as we get further down the line of our different licensure tracks there, and maybe have to adjust that based on what we've talked about today and in the future. Any other final comments on learning permit or apprenticeship and licensure 1 before we move on to the work of the day? Okay, well, I think we're going to break back out into our role-alike groups, and this time we're specifically focusing on licensure 2, although if you still have discussion that wasn't finished the first time, I'm sure that can come back into it as well. So we'll have about 30 minutes for this discussion before we come back out and share out to the whole group. So, Kim, if you want to send us out, we'll go do our work.
WebEx Assistant is enabled to save audio highlights.
You're unmuted, Hank.
Let's share out some, I'm having a hard time unmute. I don't know why. I muted myself. Oh, it must go to mute when you come back out of the breakout room. Okay. That's a real problem for me. So I don't know if your group was like ours, but we had a vigorous discussion and probably could use a lot more time talking about, but let's gather some initial thoughts anyway from the groups. I thought the EPP2 group starting this time to share out a little bit about what you guys were talking about.
Absolutely. This is Diana Lease, share out from the EPP Group 2. I drew the short straw. We had a good conversation as well. I think we picked up a little bit on our first conversation because, like the other groups, I think we had just kind of got it in our stride, and so we needed to pick up a few things. 3 things I'll share out of this session. Even though we may not have hit exactly the questions that were in our guiding document here. One of the things that has been surfaced for us and we wanted to bring back to the group is the idea that whatever assessments are identified for determining teacher effectiveness and the competencies upon which those are built, that those be applied equally across the routes along the teacher licensure progression. And we wanted to kind of share that. I think one of the things that came up, for example, in talking about internship for student teachers in EPPs is not just about counting minutes. There are actually some very rigorous assessments that go along with that. And so if we thought about what assessments like observation tools could be brought forward by EPPs and LEAs for consideration for use across the spectrum, particularly as EPPs and LEAs will be more engaged together as part of this work. The second thought that builds off of that is the idea that we need to plan ahead for the infrastructure to support the ongoing implementation of assessments to maintain the validity and reliability of data. And to a lot of our conversations here in this group, the stakeholder confidence in the data, and that when assessments are just kind of put out there and you need to go and implement them, that we begin to lose some of that confidence. It erodes the reliability of the data that we want to use. So that's going to require some engagement and support in terms of people and their expertise, but also people in their positions probably as well. The third point that we talked about in this is the value of the North Carolina New Teacher Support as a possible opportunity or a good example of a resource that could be deployed more broadly to support with coaching. And this could be with perhaps in partnership with EPBs or certainly in the current model with LEAs. But again, going back to the first idea that I shared about identifying assessments to be used across this continuum, that we would want to make sure that their metrics align to their metrics and new teacher support align to EPP metrics that align to LEA metrics. I raised this as just my personal concern. I think that some of the NTPA constructs that are used in coaching don't really align with the language in our with our school district partners, and that seems to be a big disconnect when we have conversations with our regions. And I think there's more that can be done there, and we discussed that a little bit in our talking points. I'll also go back and just mention it's still very difficult to break down one specific stage on this progression, level 2 from a level 1, from a level 3 to everything. And so I think our conversation certainly, as I just evidenced in those 3 points that I just shared, are very holistic across that. Because again, we're still working towards what are the competencies that we are striving towards, and then how might those be attained across each stage in the progression. So a little bit from group 2. Thanks, everybody.
You're muted, Hank.
I think, oh, I know. I've got a little button that I'm sitting on that's turning me off. That's great. It's pretty professional there. That's great. But I think our group kind of dovetails nice into that, and your thoughts about appointments and internships. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that.
I, I think I can re-summarize it. So we actually ended up blurring over into license 3 a little bit, because what we were trying to identify was what's the set point where a person enters license 1, enters license 2, and would enter an internship if they're in license 3, and what would be the set of credentials or knowledge, skills, experience, to Randy's point earlier, the competencies that we're looking for at that entry point, so number one, person can move into the appointment, and then number two, how do we expect that professional learning, what do we expect that professional learning to look like in that phase as they are becoming the teacher of record through that pathway? And if we could if we could articulate what that is at each one of those 3 levels, and they should be somewhat equivalent, somewhat parallel, then how do you provide the support structures through partnerships, schools, universities, whoever the provider might be, when the person is in that phase where they're moving from the initial appointment to they're the teacher of record in that case. And so we could have used another hour to articulate more detail within that frame, but that was hanging everybody. I think that was where we ended up.
So Ben, with the discussion I learned for the last several sessions, just trying to get everything straight in my head. So as you all have talked in the EPP elite groups, at what point at which license level do you see teachers becoming the teacher of record?
Are you asking me that?
But any of the EPP folks?
I think I'll throw this in. There are really 2 questions in that question.
Mm-hmm.
One is, what credentials do they need to hold at the point of appointment? So a person becomes licensed 1, they have a set of credentials in hand at that point to even hold the appointment. And then the next question comes, depending on which license, 1, 2, or 3 they enter, there's going to be some kind of transitional point to the point where we say they are, quote, the teacher of record, for lack of a better term. What happens in that transition, and who provides that? What does that support look like, and who provides it? So that person, expeditiously, I mean, we're not making cheese, how do they move to the point that they can be the sole educator in a classroom if they held that status? And because we were in an EPP conversation, we sort of lived in that transition for an intern. So what's the intern know, and what is it that the intern knows and is able to do at the point that we would say an intern can carry the class or carry can carry the teaching responsibilities if they were in the room alone? What are we looking for in that state, to Randy's point about competency? And if license 1 and license 2 were to hit that point, we'd expect parallel competencies. So what an intern would hold when we said they can be the teacher of record for X amount, whatever amount of time that is in the internship. Hey, did I just capture that?
I think that's exactly what we were talking about, so that's great. Ray, or anybody else from the LEA group, anything else from your group's discussion that you'd like to share?
One of the things that I talked to our group about, so just to be completely transparent, I have 7 EC positions open. I may be able to staff half of those with fully licensed EC teachers, but the rest of them are probably going to be folks who are coming in on an emergency permit. And so in listening to the discussion and looking at our entry levels, when those folks come in next year on that emergency permit, they'll be the person of record for particularly in an adaptive cluster class. And so I'm just trying to figure out in this structure with the apprenticeship license, I mean, apprenticeship clearly is not going to be the teacher preference, but looking at license 1, license 2, license 3, where that point is, because as and we're a mid-sized delegate, we've got 28 schools, about 1,100 teachers. How do we, in the field, in reality, make all of this work so that we have the support these folks need to become excellent teachers, the teachers that we need them to be, while also dealing with the reality of 7 EC openings and no applicants to fill those positions who are fully licensed and qualified. And I'm trying to balance that reality in my head with where we want to go to make this a stronger process that reduces barriers for folks to come into teaching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think that's an important question. It's just like, it's like as we talked about in the EPP group, we're trying to figure out the aspirational goals. What would be what we aspire to as an education department to be able to, or as a school system in North Carolina, what is it that we want out of our teachers? And then figuring out how you balance that against the current shortage, which should take priority, the aspirational of what we hope for or the current situation and how we deal with that. And so it's an important discussion to have, I think, right now, for sure.
Yeah, and it's a partnership of both. We've got to be able to set those aspirations to reach those goals and figure out how to manage the transition in the interim.
For me, that's where our discussion in our group about something like North Carolina teacher support comes in, right? It's bridging that gap. So you have vacancies where you have to make a choice. You have to fill with a position with somebody who may not be at the full level of competency that you would ideally want to see for somebody, but you can provide them with coaching and support from somebody who does have that level of competency and then some, and has the skills to help to accelerate the development of that teacher in a job embedded way, so that they are, both so that they're serving the needs of the students with support, so it's like if we think of that first level, we are changing that terminology from learning permit to apprentice teacher, for example. But then if you see, so that person is not alone in the classroom, right? But then once we move into license 1, 2, 3, maybe the person then is on their own in a classroom, but not 100% on their own. So that apprenticeship it looks different. It's not 100% of the time in an apprenticeship situation, but it's more like a medical model, right? Where there's, in a medical model, there's an attending physician who's supervising medical residents, right? So you have that coach or mentor, full release mentor who's supporting, the teacher. So, and again, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the children in that classroom, so that the children who are being, taught by that teacher have the benefit of that more experienced other supporting that novice. So that, that's my idea of an example of a way in which we could bridge that gap. And that's the kind of thing we were talking about. But I think the underlying piece that's important is that we all have to be in agreement about what those competencies are, so that we're all moving towards the same thing. And those competencies have to be measured the same by the LEA as they are by the EPP, as they are by the new teacher support person.
Absolutely.
Great. Good comments. Well, I think we'll have plenty more to discuss on this, and Van and I were just kind of chatting back and forth to each other that maybe we're small enough today just to continue as a larger group for this cross-group discussion and dig into some of these issues that we brought up a little bit deeper, if that works for everyone. I think we're just kind of getting started right here, and I don't know if anybody has something they want to share or bring up or from what we were just talking about to delve into a little bit more deeply in these last minutes that we had together.
I think I was just thinking about the discussion we were having and basically what Ray was saying about the need to address the emergency situation we're in at the moment. But at the same time, as you described it, our aspirational goals for creating a model that's going to create well-prepared teachers and eventually our goal is in not being in an emergency situation. So, and this is where all the different subcommittees come together to build that kind of structure. I understand, but it almost seems as though we'll have to have incremental designs because in the interim, we may need to be putting teachers as people as teachers of record that we wouldn't foresee at a point that we wouldn't foresee 10 years from now if this whole redesign model is successful.
Aaron, would you say a little more about in our breakout group when you talked about creating the chart? Because that has both textual and text and visual value.
Yeah, and so building upon like Randy again's comment about thinking about those competencies, I mean, just like with nurses, right? They have scope of practice where at different levels they have different responsibilities they can engage in based on the competencies they've demonstrated. Having kind of a developmental competency structure for those different licenses and it being a table, right? Like these are the things that we expect in each of these for you to be able to be left alone or be the teacher of record at each of these areas. So that it's almost like we have a scope of practice for teachers where we don't, like, because right now we essentially expect all or nothing. And so really kind of structuring that for these different license areas.
There's a lot of underlying work and discussion that we need to have to kind of unpack what those competencies are. And I'm not sure,
I'm not sure it could be done in a 2-hour meeting like this.
Right. Well, I'm certain it can't be done in a 2-hour meeting. I guess the question is, to whom does that work fall organizationally? How does that work get organized so that, because it does overlap with things like the teacher evaluation instrument, for example, right? And so, do we make a recommendation that, or somebody, or, PEPSC makes a recommendation, somebody makes a recommendation that there needs to be some statewide, basically instrument development work that goes into, deciding what are the competencies that we're looking for, how do we break those down, and what are the levels of progression through those competencies. That is going to be time-consuming work, very important and very worthwhile work, but time-consuming work that we need to make sure that has broad stakeholder participation across the state.
And Tom, we could make that recommendation to PEPSC. I mean, that's one of the action items that comes out of the deliberations.
Yes. So a couple of things in that Christina brought up that I want to address. So the work of what those competencies are would be the licensure subcommittee. So we will do the work of, if the recommendation of this group is there has to be competencies established, then that would go over to them. I think it's helpful as much as you can to say, and I still think we're grappling with this question of, is the movement between licenses, particularly from license 1 to license 2 to license 2 to license 3, is that a demonstration of mastery or competency in content and then separately in pedagogy? Or is that the integration of those two things, and a movement to license 2 is, I'm just making this up, a proficient level of mastery over both an integrated content and pedagogy measure, and then a mastery to move to license 3? If that's what you're talking about, which I think is great and makes absolute sense, you need to decide as a group that that is what you're saying, because you're setting the requirements for entering that license. So if you say, in order to hold a license 2, you must show this level of content and pedagogical knowledge, and then for level 3, it's this deeper level, you make that recommendation, and that allows me to go over to licensure and say, hey, wait a minute, you've got to develop this in such a way that we're measuring depth of knowledge in an integrated system, not we're measuring two separate skills in order to advance. And then your other question that I've lost now, the evaluation instrument. I think that has to be separate work, because there's going to be so much around this core work that you're doing, that we've got to get the core work established, and then our folks, like Dr. Robert Sachs, who is over the evaluation instruments for teachers, that may be a separate working group that comes in and says, okay, given all your skills and competencies and what you're looking for to move you through the licensure system, we've got to have an evaluation system that aligns perfectly with that. But that is still under the purview of PEPSC. That will come back to PEPSC. You may all be coming back for an evaluation subcommittee and working on that work. But Dr. Dempsey and Dr. Weddington, unless you tell me otherwise, I would like to keep the evaluation instrument out of scope for this particular work. But recognize that it's work that has to be done in order for this model to be successful.
Yeah, and to extend Christina's point, I'm thinking, Hank, we would go ahead and play out this conversation through license 3, and then maybe a way to structure the meetings coming up after that is we go back to the questions that Christina was just asking. Okay, now that we've looked at all 3, let's look at this structurally rather than as 3 different entry points and parts of the pathway, because that's taking us to the kinds of questions Christina was asking, then go off to another subcommittee, and ultimately back to PEPSC.
Yeah, I think so. Also see Diana wanted to see if there was a possibility that the licensure subcommittee could meet with the subcommittee for some crossover discussions, since this came to a point where it's really related and overlapping at this point.
Right.
I think also, I don't want to put Tom in a bad position of playing telephone, right? I mean, we can raise concerns directly, and that might lift a burden off Tom. Tom's certainly a very busy man right now.
Well, I want to restate that. So there are meetings where subcommittee chairs all come together, and I think that's probably the right place to articulate that. I will certainly prompt and remind Dr. Weddington and Dr. Van Dempsey that you've got to make this statement to these groups. But I to your point is well taken, Dr. Leese, that this is a conversation between the committee chairs, the subcommittee chairs, to make sure that work gets articulated over.
And this is, Jeff, to build off of Dr. Leese's comment about cross subcommittee work. I even wonder if it's worth consideration, because I think this competency question is one of these big cross-cutting issues across this entire work. I think that and teacher effectiveness and compensation are going to be 3 areas that are going to cut across sort of all of this work and are sort of core. I wonder if it even makes sense recommending that there be a cross subcommittee subgroup that's created between licensure and preparation that can actually dive into this competency question and come back with some solid recommendations to both of the groups about how we might think about this. What would these competencies look like? How would we measure them? What are competencies that we currently expect out of our EPPs and our teacher prep programs that we want to elevate and make a part of this? And then, I think we've got the best thought leaders across all these subcommittees in our state on this, and pulling a subgroup out that can really dive into this across those two subcommittees might be really meaningful and productive work thinking forward. But I don't know if I just want to throw that idea out there.
Yeah, and Jeff, just to follow that, there are three, I think I'm looking at the screen, right? There are three members of PEPSC who are on this call, Hank, Randy, and me. And one is, we don't know where the other subcommittees are in their work, so, they started to run into the same kinds of questions we're running into where we want to have this crossover. So number one is we sort of need to get an assessment of that. Is the licensure committee, for example, at a point where this is going to help them as well as us? And Patrick Miller can help us sort that out as the PEPSC chair. And then PEPSC itself can make a determination. We now need to create a crossover group that's working between these two groups. I do think, Tom, we probably need to get some sense of where is the other committee relative to the kinds of questions we're asking to make sure there's some continuity. Tom, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we can work that through PEPSC and create what Jeff just recommended. Randy and Hank, I'm saying that as one PEPSC member.
Yeah, it works for me for sure.
Yeah, man, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Christina and Diana, is that speaking to the questions you're raising?
I think to some extent, I guess, I feel like there's a lot of danger in this becoming fractured, and so I'm trying to think of ways that we can guard against that, and separating, and I understand the logistics behind Dr. Tomberlin's concern. I guess if we're really going to do something sort of groundbreaking and different here, I think those bigger structural things are really important, and this issue of competencies is really fundamental. And how we define those competencies, not just in pre-service but across the profession, I think it's a fundamental question.
Well, I guess my question is, does the strategy of creating the cross-subcommittee work groups start down the road you're talking about?
For sure.
Yeah, because we can take that back to PEPSC and push that back down. I mean, PEPSC can discuss that and then push it out as part of this.
I think that would help with some of the transparency of the work also. We know that the PEPSC members are very much engaged in this, and then it comes back out. But I think having a few more EPP, LEA, and other partners engaged in that a subgroup to look across would be really helpful. But one of the things that I've heard from some colleagues who are on different subcommittees in EPPs and LEAs is that the subcommittees seem to be kind of siloed, except at the top with the PEPSC representatives, and that might be helpful to make everyone feel like there's engagement as part of that work. I also think that it would help for more direct conversation and not feel like some of the conversation is being directed through members of the Human Capital Roundtable or DPI primarily, that there's some direct conversation among those stakeholders who have been engaged as part of these subcommittees. So I think that's a great idea, Jeff. I think my idea of having just a joint meeting was too simplistic. Thank you for elevating that.
No, I think yours was a great idea too. I was just thinking a little different, so it's great.
Diana's point about engaging people beyond the subcommittees themselves, Pepsi has a history when a question or an issue or something like this is presented to Pepsi. Pepsi has created work groups, and so there could be a longer term part of the strategy that is a mix of people who are on Pepsi and the subcommittees, but we're also bringing in other people who may have expertise in the area that isn't necessarily even represented in the subcommittees. Pepsi's done that with a few other questions in the past.
I know that we only have about 10 minutes left in this meeting. Are there other thoughts that people want to bring to the table from your initial discussion or from your thinking right now before we start wrapping this one up?
Hank, I just want to add one point while people are thinking, because, the conversation, the breakout conversations I was in today were great. As people are posing questions, if we can also follow that with potential solutions or responses, or if we're facing this dilemma, here's a potential response to the dilemma, because that's what we take back to one of the other subcommittee chairs and number two to Pepsi. So we are posing the questions and constructing potential solutions or responses. And I just think it's important to always follow the question with, and what does the subcommittee recommend in the face of that question? Because that is what we try to pull together. And next meeting, we'll come back, talk about this conversation before we move forward to license 3, but it will go to Pepsi as recommendations.
Anyone else? Well, I love the discussion. It's clear that, one of these licensure levels can take days of discussion if we had the time to do that. So I appreciate you giving the time to this effort and all the great thinking around it. I'm interested to see where we end up and how this morphs to be able to meet all the needs of what we're trying to do. So thank you for your participation. If there's no other discussion, Van, do you want to call for adjournment?
Absolutely. And give it 11 minutes.
I know, right?
I'll be happy to entertain a motion to adjourn unless there are other items. Is that a motion? I saw a thumbs up.
You got it.
Thank you so much. And second, do I have a second?
Second is ready.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Hearing no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all so much, and we'll be back with the next step as quickly as we can turn it around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.